This is one of these great convergences of topic and people where everything is so interesting you can't quite get enough, but we do need to move on. And in the words of Alfred Hitchcock, a word from our sponsor. Sunil wants to have an announcement.
Hi, everyone. I just thought I'd take this opportunity since I had a chance at the break and before to get some questions from people in the audience who happen to be researchers as well as some of our co-sponsors. You know, the NEA actually has an ongoing grants program, and I wanted to make people aware, if you're interested in it, that you can go to our website at arts.gov/research, and we are funding small awards to research teams that investigate high-quality data sets about the value and impact of the arts, cutting across multiple domains and disciplines. And if you have any questions, Joanna Veronkovich is in the back of the room, and she'd raise her hand, yeah. And of course, you can go to our website and learn more, as I said. I just want to be aware of that. The deadline for those applications is November 6th. Thank you.
Terrific. The second area we're going to cover are the comparative benefits or weaknesses of arts therapies over other behavioral and or pharmacological interventions for older adults experiences decline in cognitive, sensory, or motor ability. The moderator will be Becca Levy, who is Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Psychology and Director of the Social and Behavioral Sciences Division in the Yale School of Public Health. Her area of research has been on exploring psychosocial influences on aging. Becca?
Thank you. Well, I feel honored to be the moderator of this important session. So I'd like to introduce we have three presentations and 4 speakers, and they all are distinguished speakers who have been able to integrate aging health and the arts in very innovative ways. So I think you'll enjoy their presentations. So our first presentation is by Kate de Medeiros and Basting. So Kate is an assistant professor of gerontology and a Scripps Fellow in the Department of Sociology and Gerontology at Miami University of Ohio. And her research includes looking at narrative approach to understanding old age. And she has developed and validated an instrument to look at neuropsychiatric symptoms in dementia. And she is going to be collaborating in her presentation with Dr. Ann Basting, who is the executive director of the Center on Age and Community and is the Associate Professor of Theater at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And she's written extensively on the topic of how arts can improve the quality of life of older adults. And she also directs the award-winning program that I know many of you are familiar with, Time Slips, Creative Storytelling Project. So I will turn it over to them. Thanks.
Great. I have the lavalier, so I'll just kind of stand. We were tasked with, and those of you who know the Time Slips work and then how in the past couple of years we've been building it into kind of a longer-term curricular model are going to be massively disappointed because I'm not even going to mention it other than right now. So if you have questions about it afterwards, please let me know. We were tasked with comparing the benefits and weaknesses of arts therapies over other behavioral and or pharmacological interventions for older adults experiencing declines in cognitive, sensory, and motor ability. So when they asked me to do that, I said, Kate, let's collaborate. So we are an example of one of those collaborative teams that I'm going to call for at the end of our presentation and that you all called for as well. The Noises called for in their presentation. I think we're going to hear that quite a bit. So we're a living example of that. Let's see. Where's that clicker? Did he put it up here? So there you go. Oh, I can look at this one, right? Clearly, we're starting to chase, the chase is on to figure out how to remediate or delay the symptoms of cognitive decline with the changes in demographics. And I think, Julene, you have some great slides just showing that for sure. I'm just going to say that the chase is on. We looked at a systematic and integrative review of literature from 2000 on, and there are 2,900 studies that we found. So clearly there's a lot going on, but also clearly there's little that we're able to do at this point. We're finding very little impact. And so where do we go from this point on? So what we did was create a study. We did a study that assesses the systematic and integrative reviews of pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions of intervention research with a focus on arts-based. And then really the conclusion section where I'll come back on, I'm going to turn it over to Kate in just a second to tell you the methods that we used, is really looking forward and giving some advice about how to move forward in the research. So.
Okay, so I want to give you an overview of what our approach was in trying to look at this and trying to rein in all of these studies. What we did is basically did a review of systematic reviews and also of integrative reviews. So rather than trying to look through each individual study, we felt that by drawing on things that in studies that have already used really rigid criteria to evaluate effectiveness, that we would be able to get a broad picture of what some of the impact areas were and what some of the weaknesses were. So our first goal was really to set some criteria to look at the systematic and integrative reviews, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the difference of those are when I present the results. Also, I want to stress that we were only looking at people with dementia, so we're not looking at older adults in general, but people with dementia. Sometimes people with mild cognitive impairment are included with that, but most often these are dementia-based interventions. Just a couple disclaimers. This whole approach of reviewing reviews is not something that's well described as a method in the literature, so this is novel. There are bound to be holes. There are bound to be things that kind of slip through the cracks. Also, we're limited because of the lag time in publications for the reviews. Reviews published in 2012 most likely would only include studies up to, say, 2010, so there is going to be a little bit of a lag. You may be aware of more recent research that we're not going to discuss, so just as a point of that. The other thing is that we're really looking at three major areas, and that's going to be quality of life, cognition, and also neuropsychiatric symptoms. I'm using the neuropsychiatric inventory's broad definition of neuropsychiatric symptoms based on approximately 10 domains, so I'll get into that a little bit later too. So the whole systematic review is based on generally a very well-defined clinical question in which researchers go about evaluating studies that meet this question. One of the most common criteria to be included in a systematic review is to have a randomized control trial or a quasi-experimental trial with an appropriate control group. So people look at things like sample size, study design, and the potential impact. Consequently, a lot of studies are excluded from systematic reviews. So the authors may start out with several hundred and then end up with less than 20. In our inclusion criteria for looking at systematic reviews, we only looked at those studies from 2000 onward. These are systematic reviews, not individual studies. Only published in English. We used PubMed as our search engine. We excluded studies that were non-human, that focused on caregiver outcomes rather than the person with dementia. So things that focused on caregiver burden were excluded. We also excluded studies that focused on biomarkers or things other than interventions because we were strictly looking at results of studies in which all of these intervention studies were included. Our initial review came up with about 250 studies. We went through the list. We eliminated things that were, say, consensus papers or, again, didn't meet our review criteria, but instead looked at studies. We eliminated reviews that came up multiple times in the study, and we ended up with about 16 reviews. We divide these out, We divide these out as pharmacologic, non-pharmacologic, and then arts-based. So even though arts-based interventions are in that non-pharmacologic group, we put those separately because those look at really psychosocial interventions. So we'll tell you a little bit about what we found. I'm not going to tell you about what we didn't find because our paper ended up being quite long, and so I don't want to bore you with all the messy details, but I just want to point out some highlights. So I'm going to point out studies that actually had some positive findings. These are the pharmacologic studies, and really donepezil seems to have some promise. So in the review that Burks and Harvey did, they found that donepezil showed improvements in cognition over placebo. Unfortunately, there are side effects associated with that, as many of you know. Alzarin and colleagues included a study in their review where they looked at donepezil alone and donepezil plus cognitive stimulation and found that donepezil plus cognitive stimulation had more positive effects than, say, donepezil on its own. And none of the studies had results based on quality of life with these pharmacological interventions. When we looked at the systematic reviews that include non-pharmacological interventions, those are broken out to the same three categories that I mentioned before. What looked promising in the reviews that were presented in the systematic reviews were some interventions for cognitive stimulation, which the emphasis is on different activities centered around cognitive stimulation of stimulating thought and memory, but not with specific memory training techniques. Cognitive training are those exercises that really focus on, method of loci and other kinds of recall strategies. And then reminiscence is, actively recalling the past, and then different reminiscence programs really worked in several different ways. But all in all, randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental trials that were included in the systematic review seem to point to these as potential areas for promise. The whole arena of neuropsychiatric symptoms had some interventions and some approaches that looked promising. For example, behavior modification, tailoring the environment, or withholding or giving reward systems based on enforcing positive behaviors. Cognitive stimulation, emotion-oriented care, where you're really focused on the individual and his or her needs and what can be supportive of those. In others, and I guess the common theme here is that most of these interventions that worked for various neuropsychiatric symptoms were things that were really specifically tailored to that person. Weaknesses that are cited in a lot of these studies, of course, are small sample size, lack of adequate control groups, and others. So even though a lot of these showed promise, the enthusiasm was dampened a bit by some of the study design weaknesses. And then quality of life. Again, we saw some of the behavior modification, cognitive stimulation, and that tailored activities program study by Gitlin and colleagues that was cited earlier. Unfortunately, when you look at arts-based interventions and systematic reviews, not a lot comes up, although music therapy is often one that does. We found a review by Livingston and colleagues that looked at 6 randomized controlled trials using different music interventions to help with neuropsychiatric symptoms. And I say that broadly because the music interventions range from everything from participatory music to passive music, and so there's a really wide variety of activities that are included in those. Overall, we just found that the things that seemed to work really involved multiple cognitive domains, as others have mentioned. They really seem to be tailored, toward the individual, and really seem to have some meaning base. We included integrative reviews because a lot of the studies that are non-pharmacological arts-based are excluded from systematic reviews because of that study design criteria. So when we were looking at the integrative reviews, we specifically did not include the pharma things because they were often the topic of the systematic reviews, but we wanted to see what other kinds of things were being included in these reviews that weren't included in the systematic reviews. We used a very similar search strategy as we did for the systematic reviews. What we found is that there were promising non-pharmacological interventions for improving things, say, like episodic memory and executive function. But in the review that looked at these interventions, they cited limitations such as they couldn't really isolate whether it was the intervention itself or whether it was just the social environment that helped that. Or in some, the retest time was so short it was unclear whether it was retestability or actual improvement. Other approaches that seemed effective from non-pharmacologic were the validation therapy, life review or reminiscence, and snoozlin. They didn't really mention quality of life. When we looked at arts-based intervention, we only found 4 that met criteria, and again, these were music-related. We increased our search a little bit more to via the Cochrane database to see if there was anything else that might come up, and we found something on dementia and storytelling. We also looked at the Mental Health Foundation, did a comprehensive report on different interventions for older adults in general, but we did find some studies that were specifically related to dementia. Some of those are up there. The outcomes were measures like observational studies. So in the study from LEP 2003, they talked about things like perceptions of pleasure and, affective observations of outcomes, which makes some of this comparison a little bit difficult, across measures. We didn't see anything in these reviews that spoke to cognition in people with dementia. We did see some studies that spoke to neuropsychiatric symptoms. Again, it's the music studies. And some reporting quality of life improvement. Interestingly, there's some debate on people with dementia rating their own quality of life better than caregivers. And there are some other debates on exactly what kinds of approaches were used to actually come up with these conclusions. The one thing that we did walk away with, and I know this was mentioned earlier, is that there are limitations to some of the outcomes, but no adverse effects were reported in any of the arts-based interventions.
Do you need to finish? All right, so the conclusions really are what we've been saying all morning, and is that in some situations we might very well be using the wrong tool for the wrong job. That rather than looking at saying why aren't all these studies in RTCs or RCTs, maybe we should learn from that and say let's look at alternate approaches to this. Let's try to figure out the measurement tools that we're using are not appropriate. Let's try to get some measurement tools that make sense. Again, as we've said this morning, we'll reiterate it and say we need to focus on finding the mechanisms. One of the things I can feel in the room, also from my own sense of self-preservation in my own university, is it's about theater, it's about music, it's about visual art. It's like, no, let's not look at where we've divided things into departments, because frankly, I think our Peck School of the Arts should not have departments anymore, and figure out what the actual mechanism is, because there's no need to isolate one intervention. You can integrate into a themed intervention over time that builds skill, that builds based on improvisation and a tailored approach, that integrates music, movement, whatever, if you want to call it dance or movement, if you want to call it music and theater, you can integrate all of those things into an intervention. It doesn't have to pull and separate and isolate. If we're going to go multimodal, let's go multimodal and figure out what these qualities are that are working. Tell us what's going on in the intervention. And you did, thank you. Not enough people are doing it. We need really deep descriptions. This is also going to help clarify this other tension that exists sort of in the social playing field of what's happening in the discipline, which is it therapy or is it art, and who can facilitate this, and how can we get to the big enough N by figuring out who needs to be trained to conduct this intervention, and how can we offer that training to a large enough group of people that we can let's get bigger than the largest N I saw was 117. Can we get into 500 N? I don't know. Is it possible with arts interventions to do this over time and space? I mean, the senior theater groups that are working are doing massively different types of things. They're doing readers theater, so I don't know if we'll be able to get that high with N unless we really figure out, through deep description, what's happening in the interventions. I'm on my preaching mode here, sorry. Discussion and conclusion, again, develop and measure interventions that are tailored to individual context, that are not necessarily through. I think the key thing for me is looking at something that builds skill and acknowledges where people are in the present. There's a lot of movement in person-centered care work to do assessments and get interviews of who this person was. But then you only rely on that, and you're not really taking the time to figure out how to tailor that approach to make a universal design so someone can come in with a range of disabilities, cognitive, physical, whatever, because people's interests, if with an invitation to participation, may change in the moment compared to what that intake, even if it's a person-centered care impulse, is going to tell you. I include this thing. This is from 1994, which is David Greenberger's Duplex Planet. The subtitle there, which you can't read, but I put over to the side, is "Everybody's Always Asking Who I Was." And that's what we forget, I think, for people who are living with cognitive disabilities. Let's go back and rebuild who they were. But the arts have this special capacity to actually grow the person from now. So focus on the impact beyond the individual. A lot of the work, I was fascinated by your talk. Wow, this is the individual brain. But a lot of the promise from the studies that we found was on the socialization component of it and what it's teaching people. And early on in your slide, you said something about it's about social isolation from reduced hearing and capacity, and that essentially what the arts are enabling us to do is rebuild that through a common form of expression that doesn't rely on sort of limited capacity. It's pretty incredible. So let's look at those more and figure out what it is and go with that as part of as part of the mechanism of what's happening. I also want to advocate here that a lot of these arts pieces that are not being tested are things that are investing in a product that then adds social capital to that person. It adds value to a person with a damaged and stigmatized identity. And that dramatically changes how the person functions in their day-to-day life, how the kind of care they're receiving, the kind of attention they're receiving, the kind of relationships they're able to build. And I think that attention to what that social capital is and how it's working is really important. And that came out in your talk when you said, this is serious artistic training. That means something. And in some ways, it means something that it's not therapy. It actually, for some people with dementia who are overcoded in a medicalized framework, something to provide them meaning in their lives that actually is outside of that framework, that isn't coded as medicine. It's like, I was trying to think of it as like placebo plus. Like it's something else that's operating in a non-medicalized framework. And I have to finish. That said, the coming challenge, and we have not been articulating where these studies are taking place. So most of these studies are taking place in congregate care settings. And I include this slide because I'm working on a new project called Shipwrecked, which is about social isolation and people living isolated at home. What is the translation of even the studies that we do have that are all measured in congregate care settings to people, and the wave of the future where we're pushing toward community-based care? How do these things translate across the setting? We're going to have to be careful because while donepezil may act the same for people who are living in congregate care or living at home, these interventions do not. You can't assume that they'll have the same value when they go translated from one setting to the other. So we're going to have to be attentive to where these things are being tested, the setting in which they're being tested. And just the challenges of getting engagement in participatory arts out to people who have cognitive disability, living at home in an isolated situation where likely they're just watching TV is going to be huge. Here's definitely preaching. We should loudly question why low-cost, low-side-effect interventions are not implemented while some high-cost pharmacological interventions with really serious adverse side effects are being widely implemented. And Kate, can you tell me your response to, I put this slide in there. Has anyone ever died from poetry? How did you phrase it?
I said that there were no systemized tests to concur, so that we should say that as of now, there are no published results reporting on death from poetry.
All right, support collaborations between researchers and arts-based practitioners. And this slide actually comes from a summer institute we just held in Milwaukee called Create Change, Transforming Care for Elders Through Creative Engagement. And these are two researchers who participated in a living mural through a 2-hour visual arts project. And I just think that, you know, the artists are the ones who, they may not be able to explain the mechanisms, but through conversations, you can learn what it is that's happening between conversations of researchers and arts practitioners. I was describing it earlier as the artists are the chemicals, right? If we're doing this comparison with donepezil, that we really need to foster those conversations. And then, of course, support that financially. You need to do that purposefully in a way that combines the language so it's understood across. And then, of course, support the research. There you have it, lightning fast. I just want to thank the people who actually helped us review the paper, and then, of course, for everyone who made this day possible and bringing us in, because this conversation is really hopeful to me as we move forward in the field. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. That was amazing. You were able to cover so much material and keep it to your 20 minutes. So that was great. Our second presentation is by Dr. Gottfried Schlaug, who's an associate professor of neurology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Medical School. And he's the director of the Music, Neuroimaging, and Stroke Recovery Lab. He studies brain plasticity, and he also conducts very interesting interventions, which include looking at the role of singing and music making to help recovery from brain injury and also neurodevelopment disorders.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for asking me to come here and present our work. As Becca already said, I'm a clinical neurologist by training. My PhD is in neuroscience, but I'm also somebody who has a musical degree, a musical performance degree. I'm an organist by my musical experience. So it is really all of this experience that actually got me to get into the effects that music could have on the brain. It was actually a skill that I didn't have, which had to do with absolute pitch, that really got me to think of how is that skill, what are the neural correlates of that skill in the brain? And that was actually our very first study in 1995 to look at music and the brain. So I'm a strong advocate, obviously, for music. Let me? Wow. Sorry about that. I'm a strong advocate, obviously, for music-type interventions, but it really does not just have to be music. I'm a believer that theater, that other types of physical exercise might work as well. And I'm always using this example of saying, who of us knows a 50 or 60-year-old professional musicians that we would have a lot of respect for because they're also an expert mathematician? That's actually quite seldom, that if we find somebody who's a professional in one particular art, that they would also have incredible skills in other domains. So I'm a firm believer in having an enriched environment that consists of multiple activities. Music, I think, is a very unique experience because it is not just an auditory experience, but it is a multi-sensory motor experience. We know that music makes us move, it creates emotion, and there's research that shows that it engages pleasure and reward systems. And music making, and here I include singing as well as dancing, it activates, it engages, and actually it connects an auditory motor network. And I wanted to show you an example of one of these experiments that we did. Here we had musically naive subjects that learned to associate certain sounds with motor actions. They had never played a piano before. They had to learn to play certain melodies. We contrasted that with individuals that were only passively exposed to the melodies, although they weren't quite the same, just ordered in a different way. And then we did an fMRI experiment where they would hear those melodies. And at the end, they had a 3-tone probe task so that we could get them engaged. The ones that were trained on associating melodies with particular motor skills activated this network of regions. The ones that were just passively exposed to those melodies activated a slightly different network. And here was our most critical comparison when we look at melodies that were associated with a motor skill, with learning a motor skill, with actually learning to play these melodies, versus basically passive exposure but not using your motor system to learn the skills. Here we found that in particular, a region in the posterior inferior frontal gyrus on the left side, we usually call this Broca's region, but we believe that this particular region that was active in this task is critically involved in mapping sounds to actions. And it is really this connection of the auditory and the motor system and the mapping of sounds that, that music has a particular strength in. Now, we also think of musicians as auditory motor athletes who start early, practice intensely throughout their life. And our questions has been over the years, does this lead to functional and structural adaptations? Very important here is that when a musician enters a music conservatory, by that time they usually have done about 10,000 hours of practice. That is an enormous extracurricular activity if you think about this. So the question has been, is that enormous amount of practice, of learning a skill, of becoming good at a particular skill, does that translate into brain differences when we compare professional musicians with matched non-musicians? And here are some of these differences that we found. Now, these are cross-sectional comparisons here, and I will get into our longitudinal studies as well. But this was actually one of our first studies looking at the mid-sagittal size of the corpus callosum, which is a major fiber tract that connects right and left side of the brain. We thought that doing a bimanual motor activity was of critical importance for the corpus callosum, and that integrating information from both sides of the brain had to be done through the corpus callosum. Obviously, integrating auditory and motor information also involves the corpus callosum. So we found that in musicians, they had a much larger corpus callosum, and in particular, the anterior 2/3 or so of the corpus callosum were much larger compared to non-musicians, and that this effect was found more in those ones that started early compared to those ones who started late. Several years later, we also looked at 3D reconstructions of brains. We were interested actually in comparing different musicians with each other. We're fortunate to have a group of keyboard players and string players, and here we looked at the 3D configuration of the precentral gyrus, where primary motor cortex is, and we found that in keyboard players compared to string players, there was a difference in this configurations here, so that string players seem to have a more elaborate right motor cortex controlling the left hand, while keyboard players had a more elaborate motor cortex actually on both sides of the brain. So then we went to a more microscopic level and looked at gray matter differences across 3 groups of musicians. These are all keyboard players here. We had a group of amateur musicians and a group of professional musicians. They differed in their amount of average daily music activities that they had. The amateur musicians had about half an hour to about an hour of activities per day, while the professional musicians had somewhere between 2 to 3 hours of actually practicing the instrument. And we found that there were gray matter differences on a linear scale concentrated really in primary sensory motor regions of the brain, but also in the anterior superior parietal lobe, and most interestingly to us, actually also in the left inferior frontal gyrus, among other regions of the brain, such as auditory cortex and the cerebellum. Now, when we actually extracted the signal intensities, we could see that some of those regions showed a nice linear trend, while others showed a slight deviation from a linear trend, so that any kind of activity actually gave you a bigger effect initially, and then practicing much, much more wouldn't necessarily give you so much additional effect. However, interesting to us was that, and I'm a little bit sorry about this blurriness here, but there was a study that was done around the same time, actually, that looked at the preservation of this cortical or this gray matter signal over time in orchestral musicians, and found that in musicians compared to matched non-musician controls, there was, over their lifetime, there was more preservation of Gray-matter signal in this posterior inferior frontal region of the brain on the left side, so like similar or in a similar location where we found Gray-matter differences in a cross-sectional study. Recently, we've also been very interested in singing. I like singing because it doesn't necessarily require an instrument. It's a relatively cheap type of an intervention. Similar to what we did with instrumental musicians, we've looked at Gray-matter differences comparing singers, what we call professional singers, to occasional singers. We regressed these Gray-matter differences with years of practice and basically found that there are similar quasi-causal or that there are indications that there might be structural adaptations in the brain as well. We also looked at a connection system in the brain, which is the arcuate fasciculus that connects temporal lobe with frontal lobes in the brain. And here, I think you can probably see that in professional singers, this particular system was much more enhanced than we would find it in occasional singers. We're also very interested in individuals with musical disabilities. Here is a person that can't sing or that is an out-of-tune singer. And we also have people that can't synchronize to a beat. And there are actually structural correlates in the brain that are responsible for these musical disabilities. Nevertheless, I do want you to remember that this connection system that connects the hearing with the doing or the auditory motor matching regions in the brain gets particularly enhanced through music training. Now, what could potentially underlie these changes in the brain? Well, we know from animal experiments that when we stimulate particular regions on the skin or when we undergo particular sensory stimulations, then the region in the brain that becomes active usually enlarges in size. We also know that extracurricular experiences or that an enriched environment usually goes along with having a more complex dendritic architecture or actually having more spines that are connected or that are on dendrites. We know that from animal experiments that growing up in a complex environment leads to more connections in the brain, but we do not only see that there are more brain cells and more connections, there also need to be more supporting cells, so they're usually more blood vessels, they're usually more glial cells. There have been beautiful experiments that have actually shown that running, for example, might enhance neurogenesis, although there's still some debate whether or not they're really new neurons that we can find in the brain. And then there obviously, and I get a little bit hopefully into this, there are experiments that have shown if I make a lesion or if I'm unfortunate enough to suffer a stroke, then the brain might be adaptive and plastic enough to actually overcome this particular disability. So a lot of the things that I have told you so far is actually cross-sectional experiences, and we are always challenged with this, and actually I have to say that almost all cross-sectional studies have been positive, or only the positive studies are actually published. But it's actually really difficult to design longitudinal studies that would actually show causal evidence of this cross-sectional findings. So we wanted to do a longitudinal study in 5 to 6-year-old children that learn to play a musical instrument. And our first challenge was actually to try and find a control intervention that they could do. We went through various things that was out there that we could actually do. Ultimately, this study was actually never funded by NIH. NSF was then so kind to fund it, but they reduced it to about, I think, 20–25% of what we really needed. So we had a passive music exposure where we had kids that actually not really passive, but they didn't learn a musical instrument. They were in schools where they had group music activity as part of their regular schooling, and we contrasted that with kids that had instrumental music experience. And we followed these kids over 4 years. And we're actually still in the middle of analyzing the data, so I can't show you all of this. But the idea was to really differentiate between whether or not intense practice leads to brain changes which would support the nurture hypothesis, or whether or not those ones who really become good in in playing a musical instrument have an atypical brain already to start out with, that they self-select themselves so this type of activity, which would support other hypotheses. So the results that we have so far are that we can find structural changes in the brain that are different comparing professional or comparing the kids that learned musical instrument compared to those ones who did not have that kind of an experience. These structural changes are in regions in the brain, for example, here the motor cortex, supplementary motor area, and most important to us, in the corpus callosum. So these are in regions of the brain where we had some predictions or where cross-sectional studies actually showed that there was some evidence that these regions should change. We also found functional changes in the brain in regions that we had some predictions from cross-sectional study. Here the functional imaging task is a melody and rhythm discrimination task. And again, we found over time that there were strong left hemisphere lateralizations that developed in the children group. And we have also structural data looking at the connection between auditory and motor regions of the brain that show that there are differential developments over time, although this part of the study is still ongoing to be analyzed. From our correlational study, we found that there were evidence, or that we predicted that there would be evidence in the primary learning domains, in the motor domain and in the auditory domain. We had previously found that there were effects in a nonverbal reasoning domain, or using the Raven's expressive matrices test as one domain. We also had found that there were effects in the vocabulary domain, but we didn't find any other effects that had previously shown in various other studies, which are sometimes commonly referred to as the Mozart effect, in finding effects in visual spatial domains. Those were results of our cross-sectional study. Now, when we look at the longitudinal study, and again, these are very new data, and we haven't actually been able to analyze all of them, but we can find that there are effects in these primary domains, and we've also found an effect in the vocabulary domain, and we're still working with some of the other domains to figure out how we can, whether or not there are effects that are actually there. But if they're there, I can already tell you that are probably much, much weaker, and they may actually be bordering significant. So it's very difficult to actually find in longitudinal study, in my opinion, these kinds of cross or these kinds of transfer domain effects. So the last part of the talk, if I have a few more minutes, I want to spend on whether or not music can be used as sort of like an alternative entry or vehicle into a broken or dysfunctional system to improve neurological dysfunction. There are lots of proof of concept data that's already out there that suggests that there might be effects in Parkinson patients, there might potentially be effects in people that stutter. I will show you some data on people that have non-fluent aphasia. There's data on dyslexia. And then we are also interested, although I'm not going to talk about this today, on using interventions for nonverbal autistic children that are musically based. So in individuals that have suffered a stroke, for example, this individual here, where the stroke is here, and we have a disruption of the fiber system on the left side of the brain that renders this individual unable to speak, and I hope I can show this to you. I'm asking him here to say the words of happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Can you say that again? Say that again.
Yes.
Okay. Can you sing it now?
Yes.
Happy
birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Dolly. Happy birthday to you. Oh, and oh. And
so this individual, when he tries to speak, he has only really nonsense utterances that he gets out, because he really has completely destructed this particular system on the left side that allows him to have vocal output. So the question for us is, can this system that is still remaining on the right side of his brain, can that be trained to make this better for him? And we have an intervention. It has actually been a relatively old intervention, but the neural correlates of this have never been examined. There were not a lot of good behavioral data, and it has never been contrasted to an alternative intervention. So here we're teaching him, for example, to say the phrase, or actually sing the phrase, I am thirsty.
I am thirsty. Okay. I am.
Sorry about this, the video cuts off here. But what this video was supposed to show is that in the singing mode, he can sing, I am thirsty, and then through various processes, we get him to the point where he can actually then say, I am thirsty. We can go through 100s of phrases like this to actually get him back to speaking again. There are numerous examples. I can't really go all into this, but there are changes in the brain that would actually support this type of activity. So for example, here, when we contrast before and after therapy of using words and phrases that they can actually speak before therapy, and we use the same words and phrases after therapy, we can see that there is an engagement of this right hemisphere system that supports vocal output. And most interestingly to us, when we look at this connection between the hearing and the doing regions in the brain, this connection actually changes as well when we compare before and after. And I have to say that these individuals here usually undergo about 75 sessions of 1.5 hours of training 5 days a week. So they usually have about 110 hours of really intense training. And we would postulate here that that kind of an intense training actually changes not just function, but actually changes structure in an aged brain. So as I already pointed out, we have this intervention. There's already a lot of data. There's proof of concept data that this actually works. But how can we prove that it is this intervention and not some other intervention that might actually do this? So we had to come up with a control intervention that would isolate the particular aspects of melodic intonation therapy, which was the intonation and the rhythmic tapping, and compare this to another intervention that we could do as intensely as melodic intonation therapy, but didn't have these two critical components, but would still lead to some improvement because everybody obviously wants to get better. So this is actually a study that we hope to finish by this fall. This was actually a study that was funded by NIDCD, which hopefully at that point will be one of the first studies that will actually then show in a randomized controlled trial that melodic intonation therapy might be superior to a control therapy. We have also recently gotten into Parkinson's for various reasons. There is a speech motor disorder in Parkinson's, which is called polylalia, that actually gets improved with singing. And as was already alluded to, there is a form of rhythmic music activity which is actually old. This has already been described in the 80s. It's commonly referred to as rhythmic auditory stimulation that might improve actually gait initiation and might prevent falls. Here is a very classic example of this. I just wanted to show you because it's such a good thing, of an individual that has a severe form of Parkinson's with some dystonic posturing as well. And here he walks towards the camera, music is not on, and then after a few seconds, somebody turns on the music and you will actually see a very different person. Now, how exactly that would work in the brain, actually hardly anybody knows. And it is really quite a miracle that it would work like this, because the motor system is really severely impaired in this Parkinson patients. And on top of this, it is a neurodegenerative disorder, so they will get worse over time. So what we can do here is to hopefully use that type of intervention, understand how it works in the brain, provide that as basically a medication that they can use, but we are under no illusion that over time this is a disease that will progress, and potentially at some point this may not work for them anymore. So listening to and making music is not only an auditory or motor experience, it is a multi-sensory motor experience which can change brain function and structure. Music making has therapeutic potential. There's good preliminary data from several trials that using music-based intervention that can improve auditory motor impairments. And we feel that the effects seem to last when the therapy is intense enough so it can actually change and rewire the brain. There are numerous people in my lab that have worked very hard on this, and we have been fortunate with multiple trials to actually get some grants from various organizations, but recently there's come much more from private foundation and private donors that have supported our work. So thank you very much.
So thank you. That was really interesting. Those dancing and singing clips really illustrate how incredibly important this work is. So that was really great. Thank you. So our third and final speaker is also an artist. She's also a musician, and she has a distinguished research background as well. She's an associate professor at UCSF's Institute for Health and Aging. She studies older adults with mild cognitive impairment, and she also studies how community music programs in particular may benefit older individuals' aging health. She was recently a Fulbright Scholar in Finland, and she studied how a community choral group improved the health and well-being of older adults there.
Thank you very much, Becca, and also for the organizers of this very important workshop. We've been talking about how important it is to get the same people in the room who think about these arts therapies from a scientific perspective. So just let me, okay, great. So what I'd like to do today is talk about specifically music and how music is used with individuals who have dementia. And this was the topic that I chose, in part because there seems to be a relatively large literature, and I would like to put this literature in the context of cognitive aging. So first of all, what I'd like to do is talk about cognitive decline in older adults and why we need more effective strategies. And then specifically focus in on studies of music that are used to manage symptoms of dementia. And today, because of the lack of time, I'm going to focus in on the behavioral and cognitive symptoms, but I won't talk about the motor symptoms, for example, in Parkinson's disease. And then what I'd like to do is briefly think about how these music studies compare and contrast to the other pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic interventions. And then finally, I'd like to think about what are the opportunities and research gaps that we have with these data. So first of all, I want to remind everybody that a decline in cognition with age is gradual, and some individuals develop mild changes in cognition with age, and some actually continue on to develop dementia. And what I want to note today is the majority of studies that are done with music are done in this more severe stages of dementia. So that's an important feature. But some individuals continue with healthy aging, and the study, the work that was described earlier today kind of focused on that group. So I will focus more on this group here, where they develop dementia. It's important to remember that there's many causes of dementia, and Alzheimer's disease by far is the most common, representing about 60% of the causes of neurodegenerative diseases. But it's important to remember that there's also other diseases that need to be studied. Now, the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is going to increase drastically in the next several years. And I think you can see from this graph here that was just published by the Alzheimer's Association that while in 2010 we had about 5 million people who have Alzheimer's disease at a cost, direct cost of $172 billion, that's going to more than double by 2050. And at a cost, direct cost, this does not include caregiver cost, which is the primary source of care for persons who have dementia, is going to be close to $1 trillion. So this is not a trivial problem that we have in our hands. And currently there's only 5 FDA-approved drugs that temporarily improve symptoms, but we to date do not have a drug that stops either the fundamental process of Alzheimer's disease or even halts the symptoms for a time. I thought it would also be helpful to think about the context of the dementia work that's being done, which is the field that I've been in, and also the arts and aging. And what you see here is over the past 30 years that there's been significant development both in Alzheimer's disease with the criteria and several of the drugs that have been developed, but also in the arts and aging. As far back as 1981, the NEA sponsored the Arts, Humanities, and Older Adults, which there was a second one, exciting development with the National Center for Creative Aging, and most recently with the Arts and Human Development white paper, which is over on the table over there. And what's curious about this is although in the past 30 years these groups have been kind of simultaneously making developments, there's been very little crosstalk between these fields. And I think that will be one of the recommendations that we make, is that we need to increase the crosstalk between these two important fields. So the early evidence for the positive impact of music on persons with dementia came actually out of the music therapy literature in the mid-1980s. And these studies focused primarily on managing behavioral symptoms and increasing alertness in people who had severe stages of dementia. And at that same time, there were numerous case studies that came out suggesting that persons who have Alzheimer's disease had a preserved memory for music and music memory and creativity. And so these coincided with this interest. And if we look at the number of publications from about that time in the mid-1980s, you can see almost an exponential increase. And this is kind of reflecting the interest in this field of music and dementia. So to give you an overview of these studies today, what I did was took the approximately 340 studies that's focused on the topic of music and dementia, and then kind of narrowed them down to focus just on the studies that looked at more intervention or clinical trials of adequate quality, and then reviewed the Cochrane systematic reviews, and there were some new studies. And interestingly, after kind of doing that process, there were only about 24 studies that met those criteria. Just to give you an overview of these studies, the types of music interventions were quite variable. We had examples of music listening, for example, listening to recorded music. There were participatory. There were studies that involved specifically music therapy that was delivered by a music therapist. Also, this combination of music and movement was common. But as you can see, there's a lot of variability. The participants included persons who had dementia, but oftentimes the diagnoses were unclear, or they just focused on Alzheimer's disease patients only. The majority of the studies focused on individuals who were in the severe stages of dementia, were in assisted living situations, and the sample sizes on average were about 25, ranging from 10 to 60, so rather small sample sizes. But on average, the length or frequency of the music intervention was about 6 to 8 weeks, with 30 to 60 minutes being the length of the intervention that occurred about 2 to 3 times a week. In terms of the methods, because again, I focused on these more clinical trials or kind of clinical trial approaches, some of the studies were randomized, many of them were not. And the outcomes in a similar way were extremely varied, with the most common outcome looking at behavior in terms of agitation, aggression, and anxiety. The other studies focused on cognition, more like engagement or social function, quality of life, caregiver stress, and a few looked at biomarkers. Of note, none of the studies included a cost-effectiveness analysis. This slide is a little busy, but it's just meant to give you a big picture view of the findings from the studies. So on this left side here, I have more of the positive findings, and on this right side, the studies that suggested no effect of using music. So by far, you can just tell by seeing the terms that I'm using, the use of music with persons with dementia seems to affect the behavioral symptoms. So we see a decrease in aggression and agitation. Multiple studies found that. Decrease in anxiety, also decrease in depression. And then some of these studies kind of used what they call more behavioral composites, like a summary score from the neuropsychiatric inventory, and looked at some other behaviors that weren't included in inventory, such as wandering. And again, you can see multiple studies concluded that music was helpful. There was only a few studies that looked at improvement in cognition, and it's possible that memory and language might be the two domains that show some improvement after music intervention. But of note, there are also studies that show that there are no changes in behavioral symptoms after music intervention. And by far, I would say that the majority of studies that looked at cognition did not find an effect of music intervention on cognition. Of note, I put global cognition because the majority of these studies looked at the effect of music, for example, on the mini mental state examination, which is a very broad sort of screening test. So I think that story is still, we don't really know if this helps yet. And this is just one example from Roglio out of Italy. You can see when we look at the neuropsychiatric inventory, this top line here is the experimental group, which included 30 music therapy sessions for 16 weeks, including a post after the intervention ended. This is 4 weeks after. And you can see pretty clearly here, sorry, this is the music. I'm looking at it upside down here. The point is that the neuropsychiatric symptoms decreased in the group that had this music intervention. But in contrast, there was no effect on the functional status measure, the Bartel measure. And this sample included 59 participants who had either Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, or a mixture of both of those diseases. But I think this was the sobering conclusion that I think we need to think carefully about. So the Cochrane Dementia and Cognitive Improvement Group recently reviewed 10 of the studies that I talked about that met their criteria for this very kind of systematic review of the studies. And they concluded that there is no substantial evidence to support nor discourage the use of music therapy in the care of older people with dementia. And in particular, the methodological quality of these small, short-term studies was generally poor, as was the presentation of results. So I think we have to keep this in consideration when we think about the conclusions. Excuse me. And when I took the results we had data from this Cochrane review, and we plotted them using looking at Cohen's D, I think this kind of helps us think about it. So this is actually just 3 studies that we actually had data where we could look at this. And what you could see is that while there's some hints that the music intervention favors an improvement, there's a few that don't. But I think the most important part is this confidence interval is crossing over the no effect 0 point. So there's a lot of variability here. And I think although there's some hints that music might be helpful, we still have a lot of work to do to really pin down what exactly this effect looks like. So what are the specific concerns in these studies? So I want to note that the samples are often poorly defined. The diagnoses are unclear. They don't use, for example, often don't use diagnostic criteria. Or they will often lump participants who have different dementia diagnoses into one group. The sample sizes are often very small, and they come from convenient samples, for example, in assisted living, which are important to develop interventions for these settings, but it also brings a whole host of other challenges to do research in assisted living environments. The methods are often weak, and I mentioned some of the reasons why. The randomization methods are often not specified. There's multiple design flaws that I think we can improve on pretty easily. Coming together in groups like this, we can think about it together. In particular, there's still debate about what the best control conditions are for these studies. And I think several of the presentations mentioned that the interventions are not well described, so that's going to really limit our ability to replicate those studies into different settings and translate them. Also, on the outcome perspective, it appears from reviewing the literature that there's only a few scales that are really used. And for example, this Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Index is a very good scale, but it may not be well suited to look at the effect of music. For example, you have to rate the individual's behavior over 2 weeks, and if you're doing an intervention just 1 or 2 times a week, this might not be a good match. So I think we have to think very carefully about which scales we're using to look at our outcomes. And the interpretation of the findings is also a challenge. The statistical methods are especially weak. There's often missing data with dropouts that aren't accounted for statistically, and the conclusions are often stated. So I think, to me, these are challenges that we have to overcome. I think a lot of these can be overcome with good science. But if we compare this to, for example, this is our challenge. We're comparing it to the pharmacological treatment. These are 2 medications that are commonly used in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And when they ask the question, does donepezil and memantine have an effect on behavior in Alzheimer's disease? Sure enough, in well-designed studies that met international randomized controlled trials criteria, there's no difference between the individuals who have donepezil and placebo, which is the same effect when we look at memantine. Now, these drugs were not designed to treat behavior in Alzheimer's disease, and actually the medication of choice to help manage behavior are atypical antipsychotics. So in these trials, you can see some effect of the medication. This is the placebo group on top, and these are the 3 different atypical antipsychotics. So they do see some effect on behavior. In this one, it was agitation, but not on depression. But of course, the magnitude of the benefit is also very small with these medications, and there was an increased risk of death and cognitive decline, which of course is not the outcome that we'd like. And there was no effect on caregiver time, which translates into cost or the quality of life. So I think even with these pharmacologic agents, we are still struggling with finding treatments that actually help. So just to give you a broad overview, Kate talked about the studies they reviewed. A lot of them are the same that I went through. Again, on the left, we have the positive findings, and on the right, the no effect. And I think the reviews are suggesting that behavior management and education, both for the staff and the caregivers, are an effective non-pharmacologic approach. Apparently, the family-based coping therapies for improving quality of life are helping environmental management, hand massage and touch, and physical activity and exercise. But I think these studies that look at non-pharmacological approaches suffer from the same challenges that the music and arts studies do, which is they have small sample sizes, the designs are often poorly done, and the interpretation is questionable in some of them. So we are not the arts people aren't the only people who are having challenges in doing these studies. They're not easy to do. And one other thing I want to point out is that although the majority of the studies using music for dementia focus on Alzheimer's patients, we also have to acknowledge that the response to music might differ with different dementia diagnoses. And this is just a very simple task that we did with patients from different dementia diagnoses: Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, logopenic aphasia, and then 2 types of semantic dementia. And I think you can see when we ask them to just name that tune that there's very different responses that differ by dementia diagnoses. So the fact that we're lumping everybody into one group is probably not the best approach. So the general hypothesis really is that these lifestyle factors, whether it be exercise, whether it be music, I think what we want to do is be able to diminish these behavioral disturbances in dementia, or improve or maintain cognitive abilities, and also facilitate well-being. And we really don't know the mechanisms yet. And I think we can look to our colleagues like Art Kramer in exercise and look at the types of models that they've developed that help inform our research agenda and hypotheses, and that they've identified these different biological processes that contribute to the effect that we see in exercise and also into brain health. And I think we really need to push toward developing more biological models of the arts interventions. But of course, we all know in the room, I'm preaching to the choir, that the arts, and in particular music, involve this kind of multimodal aspect of functioning. And it's probably the fact that there is this interaction between cognition, emotion, and motor that creates something that's unique. And whether or not it occurs in a social context even adds another component to it. We have to figure out ways to model these sorts of complex behaviors. But I leave you with a very important point, that even if we can delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease by 5 years, which is this blue line here, by 2047, that could theoretically, by 50%, decrease the number of individuals who actually have clinical Alzheimer's disease. So I think despite the challenges we have in study design and in coming up with biological models, this is an important area to go, because it could have a very important effect on the quality of life of individuals who develop Alzheimer's disease, but also on the families, and impact the cost. So we have to keep this in mind. This is really what motivates me to keep looking. So in conclusion, the opportunities we have here, I've just summarized. Because of the methodological limitations, it is difficult to know at this date whether or not music interventions are effective for managing symptoms of dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease. But despite these limitations, there are promising trends that suggest music may be effective. Several studies suggest improvements, particularly in behavioral symptoms, and music has the potential to improve quality of life for both the caregiver and the patient. It also has the potential to be cost-effective, have minimal risk, and accessible, especially to culturally diverse older adults. So I think we have to think about these opportunities. And how can we do that? These are my recommendations for the panel, is to, by far, improve the quality of the research studies that are being done. And part of this is getting teams together, encouraging crosstalk between the music researchers and the dementia researchers, especially including a statistician, a methodologist who can help with the study design, which is challenging. Also consider using, for example, international clinical trials criterion. If those are too challenging, we might consult with groups like the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study that does interventions for Alzheimer's disease. So we could get the expert opinion on how to design some of these studies. And of course, I'd make a plug for including more culturally diverse older adults, because the majority of studies really focused on higher SES Caucasian individuals. We have to develop better models that will inform our research agenda and hypotheses. And importantly, and the previous talk with Anne was talking about developing novel ways to capture the effects of music on older adults. And in particular, I think there's a need to study more about the basic processing and understanding of music of older adults before we try to use this as an intervention. And we need to consider the effects on both Alzheimer's disease, but also non-Alzheimer's disease dementias. And finally, considering interventions earlier in the stages of dementia, and possibly the lifespan approaches that Nina talked about, where this might be something we can't come in at the last minute and try to treat these behavioral symptoms. And certainly the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases, the whole field is moving earlier and earlier, and it is quite challenging. So I just wanted to thank the Fulbright Foundation, who allowed me to go think about this on my sabbatical for 6 months in Finland, in a country that supports lifelong involvement in music. It was really enlightening. And the NIH and NIA, the UCSF Institute for Health and Aging, and this wonderful collaboration that UCSF and we've developed with the San Francisco Community Music Center, which is allowing us to think about delivering community music. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were great presentations. I guess we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions, if anybody wants to ask questions of any of our great speakers.
Can I grab your mic?
Sure. Thank you. It's a question for Becca, actually. One used a convenience sample of people who were taking a course, and you found, if I recall, positive results. But then a little later you repeated it with a randomized design, where they would randomly assign to condition. They were taking the course, and there were no time-by-conditioned interactions. Now, it would seem that this might imply original interest in the subject is necessary, but it also could be an instructor factor. We're very careful when we use other instructors than ourselves that we really get top professional people who are great at motivating. In fact, we've had zero attrition in any of our acting courses, except when somebody went to the hospital or something. But they always stay for all 8 sessions. But it's really the responsibility of the instructor. So could you address instructor qualifications and qualities versus initial participant interest?
Well, as the instructor of all the sessions, I would say the quality was outstanding. The difference, the first study involved a convenient sample of retired physicians who were much younger and also had a different motivation level, as you pointed out. The second study involved a group of people living in retirement communities. Let me just say the mean age of the first group was about 70. So when I did the other study and did it as a randomized controlled trial, the mean age was about 84. So the people were a lot older, and really the primary outcomes we were looking at were autobiographical memory measured by the autobiographical memory index, and then some batteries using like the Hopkins verbal learning test. And we did not see any change between the groups. However, we are currently analyzing a really important aspect of that data, and that is the self-concept measures. And so we're looking very finely into self-concept to see if there were changes, because just observationally, people who did the writing workshop, and you probably noticed this in your intervention as well, you mentioned that social, it's people disclose things in such a way that it's a safe disclosure, and they get to know each other in a much quicker way than they would normally. So we're actually taking some of that data and are going to test an intervention that we're calling accelerated intimacies to see if, instead of focusing on memory, that we can use it as an intervention to increase social connectedness and reduce loneliness. But it was the, like I say, same instructor across all of the interventions and all the groups, actually.
And a great one.
Fantastic.
Can I ask a question? Oh.
I was intrigued with the last presentation in terms of the conclusions of MMSA, and I would like to ask everyone about the nature of what happens when we choose an outcome measure. What messages are we saying to the community? What are the consequences of not powering on an MMSE, yet concluding that when you review the literature on that, there is no impact? And how does that fit with the conversation we had earlier about near and far transference and specificity versus global impact of these interventions?
Would you like me to respond to that? So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking me to reflect on the conclusion that music may not have an impact on cognition.
I'm going a little further. I'm asking whether there are some ethical issues associated with the nature of how we do business.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the challenge in using cognition as an outcome is that to measure cognition well, it takes a lot of time. And traditionally, the MMSE, for example, is a screening test that is administered in probably less than 5 minutes. It's a screening test that we use for dementia. It's not very sensitive. I think in these assisted living situations, it's very difficult to, for example, administer a 2-hour neuropsychological test. So we go from using screening tests to a more comprehensive neuropsychological test to try to look at this issue. So I don't know that it's an ethical issue. I just think it's a focus. I think if we expect our interventions to impact a screening test is a different question than if we, for example, are asked the question, can a music intervention affect memory, working memory, long-term memory, short-term memory? There's so many aspects of it. So I think my personal opinion is it's not a good test to use as an outcome measure. So that's just my personal opinion.
Can I just ask you, what do you mean by ethical issue?
Every time these publications come out, there are groups of individuals who translate it, and then groups of people who interpret it. And when you have significant results, there's an interpretation, but there's also interpretations of non-significant results. And as a function of that, when you have an evidence-based review that looks at MMSE, which was not powered for the original purpose of that, you're concluding that MMSE, or global cognitive health, is not affected by that. And that's really a premature message, yet it's gotten out there.
No, good point.
I would expand that a little bit, too, and say, who's seen that viral video of the guy who wakes up with the iPod attached to his ears, that this is one of that scared me to death, because the care system in which we currently have operating in our country wants every excuse to not engage with people, to reduce personnel hours. And so if even a study gets interpreted that this activates people, activates them into, we're waking people up into what? Into what context are we waking them up? If whatever arts intervention is not looking at the, if it's reduction in behavioral symptoms, and so you're making people more compliant without raising quality of life, you're creating an intervention for a system, not for a person, actually. So who is that intervention designed for? So the ethics, I think, are also there. Can we do reduction in problem behaviors without increasing and looking at simultaneously quality of life issues? That's all. That's what I'll say.
I had a question for Dr. Johnson. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had a question for you. You mentioned in your studies, in the studies that you looked at, that most studies looked at using music in people with severe dementia. Do you see potential in working with mild to moderate dementia patients?
Excuse me, absolutely. I see potential to use music in earlier stages of dementia. The challenge is it hasn't been tested yet, so we need to do the studies that really look at that. So I think it's an unanswered question, but I absolutely see potential, and the whole field of dementia is moving in that direction because we know that, for example, the prodromal period of Alzheimer's disease might be as long as 15 to 20 years. So, we're the first trial this year where we're looking at the preclinical treatment of Alzheimer's disease before symptoms, whereas the music interventions are still focusing on moderate to severe dementia. So that was my argument for we need more crosstalk. The field has changed. We need to stay connected with that.
Yes. I'm Daniel Potts. I'm a neurologist in Alabama. My father, who had Alzheimer's disease, became an artist in the throes of Alzheimer's disease and painted over 100 original watercolors. And so this got me interested in the arts as an intervention. I think the dialogue is wonderful. I think one of the things that I think we have to continue to emphasize is the impact on self-concept, the preservation of self, and this person-centered care rather than disease-centered care. We're certainly used to, as scientists, focusing on disease, but I think that the person still persists, and I think one of the things that's happening in our society as a whole is that we are de-emphasizing humanity and personhood, and that we begin to infuse that back. But how does one assess that? Is I think is one of the things that we have to come up with. But I think we have to recall that these interventions, including into late stage illness, late stage Alzheimer's disease, still help us assess the self, and that self-expression is very important. One of the things also is the relational identity that I think individuals have as they progress into Alzheimer's disease. I think their identity may become more relational and less based on occupation and those early life experiences. So, thank you.
Thank you for that comment. We did I will mention time slips now, because one of the studies we did in a experimental design and a control of 10 nursing homes where we did implement. It's an improvisational storytelling technique that's actually facilitated. It can be learned and facilitated by staff, and it invites people from wherever their disability, wherever they are at the moment, into the creation of a new story based on a prompt. And the way we decided to test the impact of it was looking at the improvement of the relationship between staff and residents, with that little leap in there that improving the relationship between staff and resident will improve quality of life and quality of care. And we found that that's indeed what happened, that sense of relationship built, not only with the people who were trained in time slipped or using time slips but actually had a spillover effect on the entire unit because it's modeling engagement in a different way, using creativity and creative expression and creative engagement in that way. So I think that's actually what we were kind of pointing to, of looking at beyond individual impact toward relational impact.
Hello, my name is Leslie Henry, and I'm a music therapist at the Milwaukee County, thank you, Milwaukee County Behavioral Health Division. And I've been practicing for 18 years. I'm just absolutely thrilled this day is going on. I would like to thank the panel because I follow many of your articles and your scholarly work. I want to ask the question if you're aware of any research out there utilizing the use of sensory profiles that occupational therapists use. I've recently, in the last couple of years, started working with occupational therapists where I work to develop some of the typical interventions a music therapist might use, and kind of correlate those to sensory profiles of an individual. Since doing that, I've been seeing even better results than what I used to see. So I'm wondering if you're aware of any research out there utilizing these sensory profiles, or if that could possibly be something for the future. Sensory profiles include 4 different types: low registration, sensory seeking, sensory sensitive, and sensory defensive. So they look at people, they assess them, and they figure out kind of what type of sensory needs they fall into place. And so, okay, well, maybe that's a future topic for research. Great.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we can just do one more on each side.
Hi, I'm Shira Clapper from Center for Aging, Health, and Humanities at GW. And there's a question for Anne. So I want to thank you for bringing up the fact that maybe we're using the wrong the wrong tools. Because as I read the literature, it seems that so many researchers are having the challenge of designing a good RCT. But if we change that into designing, as you said, a deep description or some kind of deeper qualitative description of these programs, that would probably require a re-education of the funding streams, coming from the funding streams. How do you, because my impression is that they want to fund RCTs. So, let's see.
I'm going to punt that to Kate. No, I think the future is mixed methods. I don't think it can only be qualitative. I think you have to collaborate across and do mixed methods. But I know you and I have talked a lot about that. If you want to,
I guess one of the things that we have talked about a lot is I mean, there's the issue of design and how do you do a good, solid, rigorous design, and I think an issue that goes along with that is money. And how can you get enough people across enough sites in this kind of intervention to really test, the effectiveness? And so I think that's one issue. And I think another issue, though, is looking at the measures that are used. I know Julene mentioned the CMAI, which has a 2-week look-back time, and it's looking at aggressive and agitated behaviors. But the neuropsychiatric inventory is something that a lot of studies use. It takes less than 2 minutes to do. And then there's some debate on how much you can really learn from that. Each, there are 10 domains. There's a screening question that if the caregiver who is responding on a 4-week look-back time, if that person says no, then that whole domain is skipped. So you're looking at thinking about behaviors in terms of an answer to a screening question and making, conclusions based on that. So I think that one thing that really needs to be done is not reinvent instruments per se, but to really take a close look at what kinds of outcomes can we expect and what are the best measures. And if we could get comparison even across trials of people using the same things, that would be great. If we could get much larger studies where we could agree on, these would be likely outcome measures. And certainly I think the qualitative portion is really helpful, although I think that, and I do a lot of qualitative research, I think that sometimes is a much more difficult sell, especially when you're trying to look at measurable change, but the qualitative data will give us at least the rich description through which to further consider, I think, additional measures that could be used.
Since we've been talking about measures, and I feel compelled to mention that the NIH has recently invested quite a bit in development of tools. And some of them are reported outcome, and others are more objective measures. So as this field is starting to coalesce and developing new studies, I would encourage everyone to think about PROMIS as one instrument, also the NIH toolbox, the cognitive module is 30 minutes. After much struggle, we've come down from 2 hours to 30 minutes. So I would encourage people to actually go on the website and really get the information. Those are going to be free to the public. They were developed through contracts, so it's actually going to be free to the public.
So I guess one last question. It's great that there's so much interest, and we can continue these questions later in discussion. But, sir, did you want to? I think.
No, over here. Thank you. Bill Elwood from OBSSR, and it's a much more global question. But we have a group of cohort, an age cohort right now that will age, and there's a significant group of people who also will shortly be in your age cohort of folks who have created their own personalized soundtracks to their entire lives through smartphones and iPads. And you mentioned that waking up to an iPad. How do you think that the frequent, if not constant, stimulation of music can prepare or impede music, this type of research?
There's a study that Christine Kovacs did called Balancing and Connecting, which I think is really, well, that's the training that comes out of it. I can't remember the exact training, but that looks at particularly people with Alzheimer's, and I can't remember actually how she broke out dementia in the study, but that looks at the need for uptime and downtime as a balance during the day and how to chart that and how to figure out when, it's almost a dosing issue of when for stimulation and when for reflection and downtime, and that too much stimulation is not good either. And so that the context of when and how these things are put into the day and the environment in which they're put in. One of the conclusions of that study is actually written down. People need 10 minutes of meaningful human engagement a day. And that's horrifying to me, but it goes back to the ethics of the context of how where we're doing this research and kind of the setting in which these things are taking place and how they're going to be interpreted. So,
thank you, everybody. Great session.
Oh.